It is now, for me, a great honor and pleasure to present Marie Claire Costa. Those of you who've taken the course can probably tell Marie Claire how many different readings we had that referred to projects that Marie Claire has done in her long career, both in civil society activism in Mexico, in founding and directing very important organizations, and also when she decided to go into the government with the transition away from the domination of the PRI with the government of Vicente Fox. And so she's going to talk about her experiences both in civil society and in the government with us. Marie Claire's leadership has been important to the development of a modern human rights movement in Mexico. She was a co-founder of the Academia Mexicana de Derechos Humanos. She was a founding director and directed for 12 years, how many? 11 years, the Comisión Mexicana para la Defensa y Promoción de los Derechos Humanos. And after that, and was also during that whole time very active in the development of a number of civil society coalitions and other organizations, which she'll talk about, dealing with free trade, dealing with the right to vote, dealing with citizens' rights in general. She is now working for the General Secretary of the OAS, Organization of American States, in Washington, where she is in charge of issues relating to governance and civil society the role of civil society in the Americas. So it's a fitting follow-up to her career in human rights, because Marie Claire's career in human rights has been about making space for citizen participation, making space for the rule of law in Mexico, making space for the rights of people who are dissenting to be heard. And as the students in the class know, who've been reading all the history, and others of you may know, that has not been an easy task. Marie Claire has carried out her work with intelligence, drive, determination, great good humor, a tremendous personal spirit, and I'm very pleased that she was able to come to Chicago and meet with our students today. So let's welcome Marie Claire. She's going to speak for about 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. So, and this is going to tell your friends this will be available. This talk will be available for podcast through the Friedrich Katz Center for Mexican Studies, who have co-sponsored this series along with the Human Rights Program and the Norman Waite Harris Fund of the Center for International Studies.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, for that introduction. I would just like to say that whatever it is that I was able to do and continue to do is thanks to the wonderful support from many, many good friends who are as committed to the ideal of human rights and citizen participation as I am, and one of them is Susan, whom I have known for many years, and I've also had the honor to work with her on a lot of issues that are very important and dear to us. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome you all to my presentation and tell you how excited I am to be able to share some of these ideas. I'm going to talk to you about, well, I'm going to sort of try to frame my talk in the transition to democracy in Mexico. Not that we have a perfectly consolidated democracy in Mexico, because we don't. And I want to make that really clear from the very beginning. But I do think that at least in the span of the years that I have been active, there have been enormous changes in Mexico. They are perhaps insufficient. Well, not perhaps. They are absolutely insufficient. And seen from afar, perhaps not as deep and as important as we would like them to. But nevertheless, Mexico is not the same Mexico that it was when I started working for human rights. There's been an enormous, enormous change. And so I want to sort of put whatever it is I'm going to describe to you as human rights initiatives in Mexico in that broader historical context. Now, I know from Susan that you have had a lot of readings and lectures on sort of the historical construction of the modern Mexican state and the role of human rights in that. But so I'm sure maybe many of the things I will tell you, you've probably already heard about. So just bear with me, because I will try. I will try to get to the to the description and the analysis of the modern human rights movement. And let me add another thing. What I am going to share with you today is part of an endeavor that I undertook a few years ago when I was invited by the University of California at Berkeley to teach a course on human rights in modern Mexico. It was called Democratic Change in Human Rights in Mexico. And it was really an extraordinary experience for me because I had spent many, many years as an activist. Well, I don't know if you've been activists or are activists. It takes up all your time to be an activist. And you learn a lot because obviously your involvement in, the processes that you're involved in are extraordinary. But and then I was in the government, and so this was really the first opportunity that I had to step back and think and sort of see everything in perspective. And it was, for me, it was extraordinarily useful, and I continued to pursue this. I taught, when I went back to Mexico, then I again taught this course. So I'm going to share that experience with you. So I guess this is why I am so adamant in trying to put it in a historical perspective, because it makes sense to me. And therefore, I can see where our achievements and our major shortcomings are as a human rights movement. Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to start sort of from the 1960s in Mexico, because 1968 for me and for a bunch of academics and historians and people who study these things, 1968 in Mexico is a real watershed in terms of a lot of political analysts say that this date is really sort of signifies the beginning of the transition to democracy. Now, there's a big debate out there in Mexico as to whether the transition has finished or not. And a lot of members of the left are very adamant in saying that the transition has not finished. I am one of those that believes that, yes, the transition to democracy started in 1968 and ended with the Fox election in the year 2000. And then we begin another period of the cycle, which has to do with the construction of democracy, the consolidation of democracy, but that period of transition was effectively over. And this is sort of what I'm going to try to talk about. Okay, now, from 1968 to the year 2000, Mexico goes from an authoritarian, very centralized, pre-modern political system to a reasonably democratic, open, and competitive political system. And this was put to the first test in the elections of the year 2000. I would say that the second big test were the elections last year, which were the first ideological elections that Mexico's had since, I guess, the 19th century. But going back to the year 2000, those elections were elections in which, for the first time in Mexican history, regime change was achieved through peaceful electoral means. And this is no small feat. It took decades and, a lot of mobilization and a lot of organization and a lot of people dying and a lot of people going to prison for this. Now, you by now, I'm sure, are very familiar with the sort of the post-revolutionary period of Mexican history. and especially, I guess, what I want to stress is that in 1910, Mexico had a revolution, and that revolution had a sequel of 2 decades, really, of internal strife. And, well, the first years were a civil war that ended with a 1917 Constitution, and then from 1917 to roughly 1935, you know, it was a period of coups and bloody revolts and political assassinations and great instability. And during that period, you know, Mexico lost 2 million people. It is an accepted fact that about 1 million came to the United States, emigrated to the United States, and about 1 million people were killed during this period. Obviously, massive amounts of population were displaced from rural to urban. I mean, the whole country just had a huge demographic shift. And this is important, I think, if we want to understand the transition to democracy later and the human rights history of Mexico. Okay, but after 1935, in 1935, Lázaro Cárdenas becomes the president of Mexico, and he is one of the makers of modern Mexico. I mean, he sort of builds on what his predecessor Calles does, but he builds a political system, a political regime that was enormously important, enormously successful, and actually provided Mexico with, 60 years of political stability and economic development. Okay, so after the end of the Cárdenas regime, which is Cárdenas regime goes from 1935 to 1940. I'm not going to go into it. I'm sure you've already seen some of the major sort of outlines of the Cárdenas regime, but I would like to say that that is the regime in which the workers and the campesinos who had joined the revolution finally get their share of the goods. A small share, whatever, but it was the biggest change that took place in 20th century Mexico, and I think differentiates us from the rest of Latin America in many important ways. Massive land reform. The workers really were able to organize in independent unions, well, semi-independent unions, and really a lot of just redistribution of income. Okay, so at the end of the Cárdenas regime, a process which is 1940, a process of sustained economic development begins to take place in Mexico. And things begin to shift. The workers and peasants, the populars, well, the other thing I'd like to say about Lázaro Cárdenas is that he built a political a state that was based on a state party that had sectors and organized the population in sectors. Did you see that in class? I mean, briefly? Okay. So it was really a corporativist state that was sustained by 4 sectors who belonged to the party, and the party had a boss, a jefe máximo de la revolución, who was the president of Mexico. All right, and this regime was perfected during the Cárdenas time, and it was what we now call el presidencialismo. These sectors were the worker sector, the peasant sector, the military sector, and a large sector called el sector popular, which was really the middle class and small business. All of these sectors were organized, and all of their interests were aggregated and articulated through the party machinery and went to the presidency, directly to the president. The president ruled Mexico in a very kind of pyramidal vertical structure, and nothing really happened without the president personally taking care that it did happen. Okay. Now, this sort of gave the country stability, and it allowed for a middle class to begin to emerge. So as of 1940, Mexico enters a different period altogether. Things have quieted down, the political violence, the strife, the civil wars, the persecutions of the revolution, of the post-revolutionary era, have quelled. And the new president, Avila Camacho, who is a military but comes from the middle class, all of the presidents were part of the revolutionary elite. That's why they were military. Emphasizes national unity over class struggle, reforms the education system, and also does something which in those days was quite unique. He announces publicly that he was a practicing Catholic and stopped supporting persecution of the Catholic Church, which was something that the post-revolutionary regimes had indulged in from time to time. I don't know if you've read the Graham Greene novel, The Power and the Glory. Well, it's about that. Okay. The other thing that Avila Camacho did is that he stopped supporting every strike, such as the government of Lázaro Cárdenas did, which, the government of Lázaro Cárdenas would openly side with the workers all the time. All right. The Second World War begins. Mexico joins the Allies and changes its economic model. It begins to substitute imports and improves relations with the United States, which were severely, but very severely, deteriorated after Cárdenas expropriated the oil industry in 1938. Okay, this brings about a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity, and I just want to give you some figures so you can more or less see how dramatic this change was. In 1950, 10 years after, this change, the country had almost 26 million inhabitants. By 1970, the figure had almost doubled. Now Mexico has 105 million inhabitants, but it went in 20 years, it doubled. It went from 26 to 52. It doubled again, as I said, in the year 2000. But let me give you some indicators. In 1930, 63% of the Mexican population was illiterate. By 1970, only 25% was illiterate. Now, if you can just imagine, with that population growth, and even so, these revolutionary and post-revolutionary regimes were able to bring down the level of illiteracy. I mean, we are talking about really important changes and a huge effort. Okay. By 1950, only 27% of Mexican population was urban. By 1970, the urban population was 47%. And by 1990, 70% of the population in Mexico was urban. By the year 2000, 75% of the population in Mexico is urban. So Mexico is a totally different country from what it was in 1910. All right, so thus begins a new era in post-revolutionary Mexico after 1940. It's characterized by civilian presidents, a certain conservatism, a very dramatic decline in land distribution and income distribution, and the support for the causes of workers and peasants over the increasing support for the business sector. The revolution is left behind. And now, we have this emerging capitalism, and the government are now pro-business. The original party founded by Lázaro Cárdenas, Partido de la Revolución Mexicana, is now transformed into the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, and the military sector disappears. And this situation lasts until the late 1960s. This era is marked, the era that goes from 1940 to 1960, is marked by a feeling of accomplishments. And as I said before, the violent and the turbulent past is put behind, and there is sustained economic growth. And it is called the Mexican miracle. And the country has consolidated its reforms. So the middle class begins to grow, and there's a general feeling of optimism. And it seems like finally the Mexican Revolution solved this eternal tension between Mexico's past as a colonial country and its future as a modern country. And I mean, just if you read Octavio Paz, The Labyrinth of Solitude, this is very paradigmatic of what people were thinking of in that era. The economic policy has changed. It's based on industrializing the country at the expense of the rural population. Everything continues to be at the expense of the rural population in Mexico still. But there was a national consensus that this was the way it had to go. And when some economists, like Frank Tannenbaum, raised doubts about it, well, everybody, he was quickly silenced by everybody from the right, left, center, saying, no, you haven't gotten it, Mr. Tannenbaum. We are now going to become an industrialized country. Emphasis in government is now no longer put so much on distribution, but on good administration and thrift and public finances, economic growth, stability. And the political domination of the PRI and of the President of Mexico, who is appointed every 6 years by his predecessor, becomes absolutely complete in this period. This period is what Enrique Krause, the historian, calls the imperial presidency. Because all members of Congress, with the exception of 4, in the period that goes from 1950 to 1970, were all from the PRI, as well as all of the governors. We're talking, 31 states. All of the mayors of the almost 3,000 municipalities, all of the judges and all of the magistrates of all levels of the justice system, they are all nominated by the President of the Republic. The workers and their corporations and the peasants and their corporations belong to the PRI, which in turn belonged to the president. And the party was a veritable state party created by presidential decree. So from the top, the president handled everything political, from the structure and the composition of the party sectors to the election of representatives and governors at all levels. To the way elections were organized, to the basic decisions on economic policy, such as wages, monetary, fiscal, everything. Social policy, housing, education, welfare, subsidized food prices, everything was decided by the president. Congress would rubber stamp the laws. The laws were drafted in the different offices and the different ministries, and continued to be so until the year 2000, or around the year 1994, 95. Most of the laws came from the presidential palace, and everything basically depended on the state, and the state depended on the president. And business was very subservient, because its capacity to grow really depended on what the state decided it could do. Now, the military of the revolution had long since ceased to be a problem. They were very subservient to the executive. There was a deal made between the government, the civilian government, and the military. And the deal was, we are going to be subservient to the civilian powers. We're not going to vie for power anymore. We're not going to have uprisings or attempt coups and things like that, like they had in previous decades. But in exchange for that, we want several things. We need a lot of privileges. Don't meddle in our business deals and our stuff. We want, contracts, et cetera, et cetera. And more important than anything, impunity. We want our own military justice, and we don't want any civilian intrusion into our lives. We will be loyal to the president. We will be loyal to the institutions of the revolution, but we don't want anybody to meddle in our affairs. And this continues to be the state of affairs to this day. Okay. All right. The media, the Catholic Church, and other churches and denominations were also absolutely under presidential control, as well as the intellectuals, the public universities, everything. Only the PAN, the National Action Party, which had been founded in 1939 as an opposition party, and it sort of thrived among the sort of the conservative middle class sectors, although it started off as a liberal party, and the left, what was left of the left, in the Communist Party and other small parties, were really not under the control of the president, but they were totally marginalized. They were unimportant, politically speaking. And they really, the Communist Party lived in very, I would say, fragile circumstances. A lot of its work was clandestine. It became illegal. And the PAN was really just a group of intellectuals and, well-meaning middle-class people. Well, you've seen La Ley de Herodes, no? I think that's pretty eloquent of what the PAN was like. And nobody really paid much attention to them. And these, especially the left-wing intellectuals and the communists and the left really posed more of a threat to the regime than the right-wing center-right party of the PAN. So there was a lot of repression around them, and they were in danger of losing their life and their liberty at every moment. And there are a lot of wonderful novels written by extraordinary writers, left-wing intellectuals like José Revueltas, who portray this very well. Okay, every 6 years, the president would reach the end of his regime, and he would hand-pick his successor, and then a very elaborate political ritual would happen, and the successor would tour the country in a campaign organized by the PRI, and he would kind of gain the legitimacy by this campaign. But it was actually not a political campaign because it was more like, I don't know, some kind of a plebiscite of some sort, a predetermined plebiscite. And elections were held, and people might vote or they might not vote, but it didn't really matter because if they didn't vote, the results would be doctored anyway, because the party had all of the resources of the state at its disposal for that. Okay, so, but now, apart from, little bits and pieces of dissent, there was this absolute power was really the result of a lot of things. It was a result of consensus. There was consensus around this type of regime. Personal convenience, obviously. A lot of group complicities. I would say a total exhaustion after 20 years of post-revolutionary strife, which, generated a lot of apathy and, yes, fear. Yes, because all of this was also girded by a very repressive political apparatus in which the president of the republic, there was had a very powerful intelligence apparatus that was called the Dirección de Seguridad Nacional, that was in the Ministry of the Interior and responded only to the president. The Minister of the Interior did not have any power over the director of the Dirección Nacional de Seguridad. And this, the director of the Dirección Nacional de Seguridad would report to the president every day and had a huge, vast apparatus of espionage that penetrated all of the organized sectors of society and informed. And we now know that because as a result of the transition, the Fox regime opened the archives of the Dirección Nacional de Seguridad. And, well, I mean, there was so much documentation there that Kate Doyle wrote a piece saying that I think there was something like 20 miles of paper or something like that. And I've had access to some of this information because you can access it now. And it is pretty appalling. I mean, you know, the stuff that, I mean, everybody was informed on. It's very amazing. And so this apparatus of intelligence allowed for the PRI to play a very interesting role of co-opting opposition, and when opposition was not able to be co-opted through all of the enormous array of mechanisms that the presidency had to control dissent, then, you know, the use of force would take place. And when force was used, and it was used brutally. And around 1958, this wonderful, you know, peaceful composition begins to crack. And it begins to crack because basically the regime had spawned a middle class. And it had spawned sectors of the population that were not included in this corporativist system anymore. And so there was a kind of the beginning of a crisis of political representation. This middle class didn't fit in the sectors of the workers, of the organized peasants, or anything. It was different. But in actual fact, it was the elite of the workers who began to voice their dissent, and this was in 1958. It was the railroad workers who started the first strikes, the teachers' unions, and they were repressed brutally. What they were striking for was the right to organize their own unions. And this was not something that the Mexican government was about to concede. You may have had those rights enshrined in the Constitution, but one thing is the Constitution, and the other thing are, you know, the laws and the statutes of limitations, and the other were political practices. So in 1958, there were a lot of mobilizations of disaffected workers and peasants, and as I said, these were brutally repressed. But shortly thereafter, there began to be other types of movements of dissent. And some of them took place in places like Guerrero, where the Copra workers began also to try and organize independent unions to get better prices for their work. And they were brutally repressed in 1962. Then the campesinos, in the state of Morelos, which is adjoining Mexico City, the land was beginning to be used for tourist developments, and a lot of the peasants who had not yet been given their land began to organize and demand that this sort of spread of urban land be stopped and that the land given to the campesinos. And they were headed by a peasant leader called Jaramillo. Well, Jaramillo would not give in to any of the moves of the government to try to get him to calm down and demobilize. So finally, he was assassinated. The army assassinated him openly, and that was also in 1962, and that was the end of the campesino movement in Mexico, and there really has not been. That eventually led to the guerrilla movements, the different guerrilla movements that we've had in Mexico since then. Now, a lot of this repression can also be attributed to the extreme ideological polarization caused by the Cold War in Mexico. This was like the Mexican version of the Cold War. And there were laws, the famous laws for the protection of democracy that were promoted by the U.S. and all of Latin America, had their expression in Mexico under the Article 145 and 145 bis of the Criminal Code that penalized social dissolution, but also because there was an enormous influence of the Cuban Revolution in those days. And Mexico was a country with a revolutionary tradition. Therefore, revolution was something that caught the minds and the hearts of the Mexican people. And the Cuban Revolution, Cuba, very close to Mexico in many ways. So there was enormous influence of Cuba on Mexico, and so that this really made the repression of the left a sort of a necessity of the first order in order to preserve, according to the president Díaz Ordaz, a necessity. Okay, so what we have is this changing society, these emerging sectors that are no longer, they just don't fit into the system anymore. And the response of the regime is a very repressive response. They don't know how to deal with these things. But at the same time, all of this repression begins to undermine the legitimacy of the regime. So what happens is that, and this is something that is not very well known, the government decides that something has to be done about elections, that perhaps what we have to do is begin to open up the electoral system. So as of 1946, every time there's a serious political crisis in Mexico that ends with bloodshed and repression and people being put in prisons, there was a little electoral reform. Just enough to kind of open a little wedge there so that, maybe some of the disaffected would come in. So in 1946, the absolute control of the president over the electoral process had made the establishment of political parties almost impossible. Well, after the emergence of the Movimiento de Liberación Nacional in 1961, the government decided to have a little electoral reform. And so they opened up in 1963 and opened up the electoral regime just a little bit so that there would be some kind of proportional representation. Now, nobody in Mexico, except the PAN, was interested in electoral reform. I mean, this was not on the books. People were not really interested in having free and fair elections. They wanted the right to organize, the right to strike, the right to their land. They wanted what was due to them because they had fought a revolution or their parents had fought a revolution for that and they still had not gotten that. Or the middle class wanted lower electrical rates or whatever, or free education, but it wasn't about voting. But that was always the response of the government, to open up the electoral system. Okay, in 1961, because of this repression and this very closed political system, an interesting thing happens. A group of politicians who were very alienated and disenfranchised, who had sort of been the left nationalist part of the party, and very influenced by the Cuban Revolution, decide to found a movement. And the movement is headed by none other than Lázaro Cárdenas, the ex-president. And this movement is called the Movimiento de Liberación Nacional, and it starts in 1961. Now, what did the Movimiento de Liberación Nacional attempt to do? It attempted to counteract the predominance of the right wing in the government and the political system. It didn't want to change the political system. It just wanted to counteract the influence of the right, because as far as they were concerned, the right had taken over the institutions of the revolution. A lot of this resonates until today, because a lot of in the discourse of a lot of sectors of the left, there is still this idea that the revolution, the real institutions of Mexico that were forged through this revolution have been taken over by the right. So it's a lot. What we're seeing a lot of today is a playing out of things that started several decades ago. Okay, but what I want to point out about the Movimiento de Liberación Nacional was that this was the first nonpartisan political movement in Mexico, and it was the first attempt to create a citizen-based political organization. And it was attacked and it was disbanded. But it did produce what I said before, the electoral reform of 1963. Now, from 1963 to 1988, you begin to have a process of political forces and social forces trying to force an opening in the system and having more political space. And as I said before, the response of the government is always to have an electoral reform and push it open a little more and a little more. And as a consequence of this, Mexico begins to have a very schizophrenic mentality. It's split between two forms of political legitimacy. The traditionalist sort of corporativist legitimacy of the regime is because it gives us, it distributes, it lives up to its promises of a revolutionary regime, and on the other hand, sort of the beginning of a modern electoral one. Now, but this is again a reflection of the split in Mexican society and of its huge inequality, because even though there was a revolution, Mexico is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and the second after Brazil. Okay, but all of this decade of the 60s and the 70s, what you have, as I said before, is the middle class organizing and demanding more things. And the only force that could give a voice to this middle class was the left. The left that was illegal, that was severely repressed, whatever, but that had retrenched in the universities. So it was the era of the student movements. But this was the era of the student movements all over the world, except that in Mexico, the particular expression of that discontent was headed by the left. Okay, I won't go into details. We know that the student movements of the 60s in Mexico were brutally repressed from day one, and this ended, several movements were very repressed. This ended with massacres, the massacre of Tlatelolco, the massacre of 1971. And that brought about this enormous crisis of legitimacy. Now, the structures of the system were still strong enough to keep the system afloat. But society no longer felt represented by this system. So the new government after 1968, which is the Echeverría government, continues to repress and represses students and actually carries out a massacre that you read about, which is the massacre of 1971. But again, it attempts an electoral reform, and it lowers the voting age to 18 years. And it opens up the congressional elections for the opposition, and proportional representation is strengthened. And again, they continue among this trend of trying to solve the problems of representation through electoral means without ever touching on the core issue. And the core issue was an institutional framework that just didn't represent the forces of society anymore. Okay, but what happens? All of this repression, and the repression in the countryside also, because there was repression of peasant movements and of the rural middle classes in the state of Guerrero especially, which is where Acapulco is, and it was a very developed state in terms of, comparing it with the rest of the country, generates a guerrilla. And so in the 70s, you have several guerrilla movements in Mexico. And you have the Dirty War, what is now known as the Dirty War. And the suppression of the guerrilla in Mexico was the same kind of suppression of guerrilla movements that took place in all of Latin America. And that spawned the first sort of human rights response, which was basically the families of the disappeared, of the victims of disappearances, because the government counteracted the guerrilla movements with this technique of enforced disappearance and torture and all of the arsenal of counterinsurgency tactics that were used everywhere in Latin America. This generates a movement, a social movement, headed by the families of the disappeared. But it also generates a very populist response on the part of the government, because the government knows that it's on the losing side of the legitimacy equation. And it begins, Echeverría, because the guerrilla also affected the business sector and assassinated a lot of very prominent business leaders. And when the president goes to the funeral of Garza Sada, who was one of the big businessmen of Monterrey in 1973, he was assassinated by the Movimiento Liga Comunista 23 de Septiembre, the business sector turns its back on the president. And this was the first time in Mexican history that the business sector, who had been created by the state and by the government, actually becomes independent. And that's when Echeverría decides that he has to carry out a very populist policy. So he begins to hand out money. And what happens is that Mexico's debt goes from $4 to $20 billion in a few years. So there's a devaluation and an inflation. And from that time, from 1976 was when this happened with Echeverría, to 1994, the end of every presidential term in Mexico is characterized by this, by debt, by inflation, and it's all due to overspending from the government because it is trying to contain this social upheaval with populist measures. And then later on, because it goes to sort of a neoliberal economic model, and then through corruption and sweetheart deals and a lot of very reckless spending. Okay. But what happens also is that in 1977, the situation is so bad that the new president of the PRI, who ran his election campaign all by himself because there was not one opposition candidate who wanted to go through the farce of an election, suddenly realizes that he has to sit down and negotiate with the left and bring the Communist Party out of its clandestine situation, and because the guerrillas were backed by the Communist Party and by all of that structure, and pacify the country. So in 1977, there is a political reform that for the first time incorporates the left. And it does something which is, what the left wanted to negotiate. The left, in fact, what it needed were guarantees that it would not be persecuted. And the government, for the first time, was willing to give these guarantees that it would not persecute. And the families of the disappeared had a lot. That movement that I talked about, that was headed by Rosario Ibarra de Piedra, had a lot of importance in that, because they staged hunger strikes, and they kind of put the situation of repression out there. Now, by that, and so the government was forced to concede that, yes, it killed, disappeared, and tortured opponents, and that it would not do so anymore if these opponents were to become a legalized political party and enter into elections. So in 1977, you have another electoral reform. But by this time, the left has decided, or has enough strength, to come round and actually accept the electoral reform and enter into the... So a trend that started in 1946 is actually kind of sort of consolidated in 1977. Now, what this does, and I'm going at breakneck speed because I know we're running late. We kind of started late too, but it opens a space for civil society to begin to emerge. And this breakdown of all of these financial crises that, you know, at the end of every term of presidency, begin to open more and more space for society to take over. And especially in the 80s, this trend begins to really consolidate. As you know, in 1985, there is an earthquake in Mexico City, and this earthquake just leaves the government without any capacity at all to deal with the 25,000 victims of the earthquake. The government was totally paralyzed. So this, in the minds of the Mexican people, this monster, this Leviathan that had been created, is suddenly reduced to ashes, and we all, the inhabitants of Mexico City, have to go out and organize our own rescue parties and bring out, you know, people from under the rubble and begin to reconstruct. And this is, again, a watershed. And around that time, to just now I want to focus on the human rights movement, there were already the beginnings of a concern for human rights. First, it had started in the previous decade with all the political repression. Amnesty International began to work in Mexico very seriously. I was in those days running the Mexican section of Amnesty International, and Amnesty played a very important role in reaching out to the victims of disappearances and the movements and the families, and opening space for these people, for this movement. But all of the human rights movement was always centered around the victims of political oppression, and it never moved from there. This was one of its main strengths, but it's also been one of its main weaknesses, because it went hand in hand with this process of incorporating political elites into the electoral system. And although there are a lot of very important things that the human rights movement began to do, like opening political space, it never moved away from considering and looking at human rights issues only from the standpoint of the human rights of people, of political opponents, until this day. Now, that doesn't mean that there is not a lot to be done yet. I mean, I think that the repression in Oaxaca is very clear, that just happened a few months ago. It points very clearly to the fact that things have not really changed that much in Mexico, at least in certain parts of the country, and that to be in the opposition still means that you can be a victim. But it also put the human rights movement into a corner, because when the legitimacy of the PRI really crashed was in 1988, when again the founders of the Movimiento de Liberación Nacional regroup in the PRI. By then it was Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas and Porfirio Muñoz Ledo and Eberto and a bunch of people. And they coalesce again, and they break away. And they, the ones who are in the PRI break away from the PRI and create the Frente Democrático Nacional and run an election that for the first time really puts the PRI on the losing side and forces all of the electoral fraud that had been going on for decades, forces it out in the open. This really produces a massive crisis of legitimacy. That this civil society that had been working on issues of human rights in the 80s, like the Mexican Academy for Human Rights, which I was a co-founder of, and other groups, mostly around the Catholic Church, who'd been working mostly with refugees. We did not work with Mexicans. Most of the work was done around issues of refugees, because that was the time when we had wars in Central America. But as of 1988, with the electoral fraud and Salinas becoming the president of Mexico, the movement, the sort of this growing movement begins to take on the cause of democracy and the cause of basic freedoms as its major sort of domestic cause. And, that is sort of, I would say, the beginning of this very successful mobilization of civil society around the issue of human rights. But the government countered that with a stroke of genius, which was the creation of a state institution called the National Human Rights Commission, in the best tradition of the PRI. In 1990, Salinas, just before he begins the negotiation of the free trade agreement with the United States, the human rights movement had been able to produce a report called Mexico, A Policy of Impunity. At that point, we had already established some alliances with groups in the United States, and Human Rights Watch and the Mexican Academy of Human Rights produced a report on violations, human rights violations inside Mexico. And this was the first time that a domestic group was able to do this kind of work. Well, the reaction of the Salinas government was to create a huge government bureaucracy called the National Commission for Human Rights that only just sort of co-opted the human rights movement. So that moved the human rights movement more in the direction of fighting for political freedoms. And again, fighting for the freedoms of the political opposition. And there was a lot to fight about in those days. 350 sympathizers and members of the PRD, which was the party that was created by Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas after the 1988 electoral fraud, were assassinated in those days for trying to organize free and fair elections in the states. The Zapatista movement emerged. So in that decade, and some figures are beginning to come out, the amount of political killings that went on was enormous. And that kept the human rights movement very busy. That and trying to establish a system of free and fair elections, because at that point, it was very obvious that all of the political elite, from the left and from the right, was geared towards establishing a competitive democratic movement. And this takes us to the year 2000. And I think that the human rights movement was enormously effective in helping mobilize civil society around the need for free and fair elections. And it was enormously effective in mobilizing society against the use of force against political opposition. But it was not effective, and it has not been able to deal with other serious, more structural human rights issues. The nature of the regime itself, the causes of impunity, the nature of not of the political regime, because we have a different political regime, but some of the institutions of this new regime are still the old institutions of that old authoritarian state. The justice system, for instance, continues to be the same justice system, with some changes, but mostly the same justice system of 40 or 50 years ago. So I think that the human rights movement now is at a crossroads, and it has got to assimilate the fact that there was a transition and that the agenda for the next years has to be the agenda of building a democratic state with democratic institutions. And the old struggle still has to be maintained in areas like Oaxaca and other parts of Mexico that have not yet had this democratic reform. But in general, the country is now faced with a totally different set of very serious human rights issues that I think we are still not very prepared to look at. I'm sorry I took up so much time, but I hope that this gives you an idea of where we are. You want me to talk about the Gallardo case?
Well, he doesn't know about it. I think it might be just as a little illustration.
Okay. This was a case that I was very involved in. And it showed me a lot about how the military in Mexico operate. This is the case of a general of the Mexican army. His name is Gallardo, Francisco Gallardo, who was one of the sort of the young generals in the 90s. He was put in prison in the 90s, in 1994, because he didn't go to the military. He didn't do what most of the military, high-ranking military elite did. He went to the National University of Mexico instead of going to the Army War College. He was just different. He got a PhD in public administration. And he had a meteoric career in the army. And he got into trouble. There was some infighting, political infighting, and his clique was on the way out. And the new clique didn't like him. And they accused him of stealing. He used to run a horse farm for the a breeding farm for horses for the cavalry, and he'd won a lot of prizes and so on. And so he's not the pleasantest of people. So he alienated a lot of people. Anyway, they charged him with stealing the oats that they feed the horses, and they charged him with a lot of minor crimes, and they put him in prison with 28-year sentence.
In the military courts. In
the military courts. Because when he tried to defend himself, he began going to the Supreme Court. He had the courage and the audacity to go to to appeal to the Supreme Court every time that he was charged and convicted of a crime under the military code. And the Supreme Court would actually liberate him and say, well, and so...
And then they'd charge him again.
They would charge him again. This was done 13 times over a period of 5 years. There was a moment there when and he wrote his thesis on the need for a military ombudsman and for the need to bring the military under civilian justice. Well, that was the limit. They slammed him into prison, and they gave him a 28-year sentence. Just to give you an idea of what this means. Yeah, of what this means. Mexico doesn't have the death penalty. And in the military, there is still the death penalty in the military code. But it is always commuted for a 20-year sentence. So Gallardo got 8 years more than somebody with a death penalty should have gotten. So just to give you an idea. Okay, we got involved in that, in this case. The human rights movement decided to get involved in this case as a test case for proving that the military had a different status, and that even the military officers, high-ranking military officers, wanted the military to come under civilian control. Well, after many years of fighting, and even when I was a government official, he was still in prison. I almost lost my job several times for trying to get him out of prison, and we were able to get him out of prison, thanks to the fact that he went to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and the court. And on the side of even the president, Fox, supported his cause. We were able to get him out of prison, but we have never been able to get anything changed in the criminal justice code of the military. He hasn't even been able to get the reparations. He was stripped of all of his, rank, pension. His family doesn't have access to social services or health services anymore. We have not been able to regain them. So that just gives you an idea of the strength. But that is one of the items pending for the human rights movement, to bring the military under real civilian control.
And I just want to ask one little sort of follow-up question. It also seems to me that then the increasing use of the military, which is on the increase, to fight drug trafficking means that this dual system of justice, not that the civilian courts are so fabulous, but the fact that if the military's power and jurisdiction and profile in society increases, this becomes a more dangerous factor in terms of human rights violations and impunity for those violations, et cetera.
Yeah, because the military are not trained to be police. They are trained to be military. So they detain people, especially in the rural areas, and they torture them. They treat them like, not that the military should torture, but they were trained in dirty war techniques, and because Mexico has not had a truth commission, and that has been another failure of the human rights movement, I would say, to the whole issue of transitional justice, and I know Emilio talked about it. All of the connections of the military to the dirty war and to, all of that is still very murky and obscure. So the military continue to be trained by the officers who used to do the counterinsurgency techniques in the days of the guerrilla and so on and so forth. So that, they detain people and they torture them. And then what happens is that they hand them over to the civilian authorities because they're civilians. They can't be tried. And the civilian authorities never investigate what happened to these people under the military. I had to handle a case like that one of the human rights groups, the Miguel Agustin Pro, worked on, which is a very famous case of two campesinos in Guerrero, Montiel y Cabrera, who were charged with drug trafficking, and in fact they were fighting for their lands, and they were detained by military and tortured, and not one civilian judge would even look at the documents that the government produced. The federal government produced, documenting the torture that these people had undergone in the hands of the military. They wouldn't touch them. They wouldn't look at them. This is not because, I don't think because they would have been threatened necessarily by the military. It's just, you don't mess around with the military. That's sort of in the culture. And that's part of that deal.
Other questions? Let's get, you know what, let's get all three, Laura, Shula, Hannah, let's get all three questions out, and then Marie Claire can kind of think about what the issues are and organize. So, Shula, you had your hand up first, so why don't you?
Como bien mencionó, el PRI todavía tiene mucho poder en algunas regiones de México. Y quiero saber cómo es el PRI de hoy y en las relaciones con los derechos humanos y piensa que va a cambiar o tiene que abrirse.
Okay.
Laura?
You mentioned earlier in your lecture that so many policies have been made at the expense of the rural population. And I was just interested about in your thoughts on if we really have arrived at democracy now, if we're beginning to see electoral strategies for change amongst the rural population, or if there's still political isolation both from without and from within.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
Hannah?
Quería saber si usted podía hablar sobre su experiencia en el régimen de Fox, bajo la administración de Fox.
Sí.
¿Qué pasó? Mientras tenía su campaña, él habló de tener una comisión de la verdad.
Sí.
Pues nunca pasó.
Okay. Perfecto. Okay. 3 difficult questions. La primera la contesto en español.
¿Contestan todos en español?
O las contesto todas en español. El PRI. El PRI no le interesan los derechos humanos. El PRI sigue siendo un partido... Bueno, no debo decir eso, porque evidentemente hay gente dentro del PRI y hay élites dentro del... El PRI son muchas cosas. El PRI es una coalición, una coalición de grupos políticos muy diferentes. Ahora, el PRI de ahora, que cada vez se vuelve más difícil de mantener. Fue antes una coalición de grupos políticos sostenidos por el poder del presidente y del Estado. Y cuando eso desaparece, pues el PRI también se resiente mucho. Hay sectores del PRI, como el sector sedillista, que ven el tema de los derechos humanos con menos antipatía que otros sectores del PRI, porque entienden que la democracia tiene que llegar para quedarse, que es importante, pero que no les gusta. No les gusta. No les gusta porque significa quitarle al Estado cosas como el monopolio de la acción penal, no al Estado, al Poder Ejecutivo, meterse con los militares, lo ven como desestabilizador, ¿sí? Y yo diría que es el sector que apoya a la Comisión Nacional de Derechos Humanos y toda esta institucionalidad que construyó el PRI de Salinas para, de alguna manera, cooptar al movimiento de derechos humanos e institucionalizar las demandas, ¿no? Y que en realidad el efecto que ha tenido ha sido el de, pues yo diría, favorecer la impunidad, porque la Comisión Nacional de Derechos Humanos finalmente no resuelve los casos importantes no los resuelve, ¿no? Entonces, esa yo te diría que es un sector del PRI. Hay otro sector del PRI que ve a los derechos humanos con abierta hostilidad. Y ahí tienes Oaxaca, ¿no? O sea, no solamente en Oaxaca no hubo un canal de participación para todos estos grupos emergentes. Es decir, Oaxaca para mí representa lo que yo describí para México a nivel nacional en los 60, pero en Oaxaca sucedió ahora. Es decir, es un sistema político cerrado, totalmente cerrado, en un estado donde está la población más pobre del país, indígena, fragmentada, todos los problemas imaginables están en Oaxaca. Y era el estado ya desde hace mucho tiempo donde más violencia política había. Ahora, ahí, es decir, el dominio del PRI en Oaxaca es el dominio caciquil, autoritario, brutal, y es el dominio de la fuerza, ¿sí? ¿Sí? Y de la muerte y de de la tortura y de todo esto, y lo ves, ahí está, ¿no? Claro, todo esto ahora recubierto por estas instituciones que surgen como la Comisión Estatal de Derechos Humanos de Oaxaca y en la Procuraduría ahora ya tienen una oficina de derechos humanos, pero finalmente todo esto va a dar a un sistema de justicia manejado básicamente por the powers that be que están en el PRI. ¿Me explico? Entonces, yo te diría que eso es un poco y el PRI cuando te habla de derechos humanos, la dirigencia del PRI te habla de los derechos de los trabajadores y de los campesinos, pero así en abstracto. Te sigue hablando de la retórica revolucionaria de antes, pero recubierta como de modernidad, ¿no? Pero no son los derechos civiles y políticos, ni el derecho a la justicia lo que le importa al PRI. Al PRI le importan otras cosas. Y con esto no quiero decir que no les importe, le importa la pobreza, ¿no? Ven a los derechos humanos como políticas redistributivas. Bueno, esto es muy compleja mi respuesta, pero espero haberte podido orientar en algún sentido. Los campesinos. Bueno, todo el desarrollo de México de los 30 para acá ha sido a expensas de la población campesina. Esto es tan evidente, pero tan evidente. Primero porque la industrialización se hizo a expensas de la población campesina, con precios subsidiados, precios agrícolas subsidiados, ¿no? Y con un control férreo. O sea, todo este aparato que construyó Lázaro Cárdenas, que fue la CNC, que fue para distribuir la tierra, para crear cooperativas agrícolas, para apoyar al campesinado, desde la presidencia, después se fue convirtiendo en un aparato de control político y de sometimiento y de paternalismo. Entonces, hasta que eso se desmanteló y fue sustituido ahora por un sistema, yo diría medio perverso, de tratar de reducir la población campesina, por esta idea de que el campesinado es un obstáculo para la modernidad. Y yo me acuerdo de un discurso de Zedillo frente a campesinos en Guerrero que le reclamaban una serie de cosas y Zedillo les dijo, bueno, pero ¿qué esperan ustedes? Si siguen siendo ustedes el 27% de la población. Cuando sean el 4% podemos hablar. O sea, ¿no? Entonces, sigue prevaleciendo mucho en las políticas de desarrollo la noción de que hay que acabar con la agricultura campesina. ¿Sí? Y bueno, ahorita está toda esta discusión, porque ahorita ya entra en vigor la parte de NAFTA que tiene que ver con la importación de grano, ¿no? Pero dicho sea de paso, México, al firmar el Tratado de Libre Comercio, se estableció un periodo de 15 años para ir quitando los subsidios a la producción de maíz y de frijol en México. Pero el gobierno de México se adelantó y quitó los subsidios desde el principio, ¿no? Entonces, esto te revela que hay una intencionalidad ahí de acabar con el campesinado. Ahora, no es tan fácil acabar con el campesinado. Primero porque es un campesinado que tiene 2-3 milenios atrás, ¿no? Y dos, porque sigue siendo el 25% de la población, o sea, sigue habiendo 25 millones de campesinos. Ahora, muchos de los cuales están viniendo acá. Pero lo cierto es que no ha habido un movimiento político en México que reivindique los derechos de los campesinos, todavía. Porque la izquierda... O sea, la derecha, el PAN, bueno, para el PAN los campesinos deben dejar de existir. Y para la izquierda no hay una propuesta. Ay, bueno, está NEC, están la Confederación Campesina Cardenista, pero no ha logrado todavía aglutinar a mucha gente, ¿no? Tu pregunta era con Fox. Bueno, mi experiencia con Fox. Mira, yo fui invitada a participar en el gobierno de Fox. Yo nunca fui creyente en que Fox iba a lograr las grandes transformaciones del país. A mí siempre me quedó muy claro que eso era el voto útil y lo hice y voté por Fox y llamé a votar por Fox porque para mí era el voto útil y porque para mí había que sacar al PRI del gobierno. Eso era lo más importante. Bueno, después Fox me invita a participar en su gobierno. No Fox, me invita Jorge Castañeda, que es diferente, muy diferente. Un intelectual y político pues, de la izquierda, muy talentoso, al que nombran ministro de Asuntos Exteriores, y entonces me invita. Y Jorge y un grupo político con el cual yo tengo realmente mucha afinidad, nucleado, digamos, alrededor de Jorge y de Adolfo Aguilar Sincer, que trágicamente murió hace un año y pico. Y que es gente con la que yo trabajé mucho en la década de los 90, alrededor de Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. Entonces, bueno, yo acepto formar parte de ese gobierno. Y me nombran embajador especial para los derechos humanos. Entonces teníamos toda una estrategia y teníamos todo un plan. Y la verdad es que la estrategia era, el diagnóstico era, no hay una fuerza suficiente en México para generar un cambio sostenido en materia de derechos humanos. A los partidos políticos no les interesan los derechos humanos. Los partidos políticos se embarcaron en una lucha de décadas para abrir el espacio político, pero el tema de derechos humanos no es un tema que les importe a los partidos, ni siquiera al PAN, que se supone que es el partido de los ciudadanos. No, se detiene ahí, ¿no? Entonces, el movimiento de derechos humanos es un movimiento débil, o sea, es un movimiento importante, fuerte en el país, pero no tiene la fuerza para modificar realmente las estructuras de poder que hay que modificar en el país para poder hacer las transformaciones que México requiere, las reformas que México requiere y que garantizarían el Estado de Derecho, básicamente. Entonces, ¿qué podemos hacer? Bueno, hagamos alianzas hacia afuera. Es decir, invitemos a Naciones Unidas, invitemos a los organismos internacionales de derechos humanos, invitemos a las ONGs, invitemos a los actores externos a entrar al país. Y esto fue bien importante porque toda la década de los 90, el movimiento de derechos humanos poco a poco se fue abriendo hacia el exterior y pidiendo ayuda al exterior. Entre otras cosas porque tenías una Comisión Nacional de Derechos Humanos que todo te resolvía todos los casos diciendo que no había pasado nada, ¿no? Entonces, eso fue la estrategia. Construyamos alianzas con esas instancias internacionales y veamos si eso nos abre un espacio político que permita generar una nueva forma de sociedad civil que empiece a pelear por estas cosas. Bueno, yo no sé si fue una estrategia exitosa. Y lo que hicimos fue meter más stakeholders. Lo que pasa es que nunca nadie contó, bueno, en fin, con muchas cosas. Pero una muy importante, el 11 de septiembre de 2001. El 11 de septiembre de 2001, la invasión de Irak le dio un golpe, yo te diría, un golpe de muerte a toda la estructura de derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas. Le quitó fuerza, le quitó legitimidad internacional, pues, y también, entonces, pero además la agenda del mundo dejó de ser alrededor de los temas de derechos humanos y democracia y pasó a ser alrededor de los temas de seguridad. Entonces, pues de repente construyes alianzas con aliados pues, que son muy débiles, ¿no? Ahora, eso no quiere decir que no se hayan abierto espacios importantes para que estas instituciones no sigan jugando un papel bien importante en México, más que nunca. Pero no, todavía no han tenido la fuerza como para oponerse al establishment. Y el establishment sigue siendo, por ejemplo, una alianza, una coalición del PRI, de los sectores más conservadores, del PRI, del PAN, del PRD, de los partidos y las instituciones de derechos humanos, la nacional y otras, que se oponen a la presencia de los organismos como la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de Naciones Unidas. Eso es lo que yo te podría decir.
Pues
Ok.
gracias, María Claire.